you a chance to work out your volume and audio, make sure everything's running smoothly. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Social networking for the Haystack MacArthur Foundation Digital Media and Learning Competition. We are this year partners with the Mozilla Foundation in the Badges for Lifelong Learning competition. And joining me hosting this webinar is Carla Casilli, who's Operations Project Manager for the Mozilla Foundation's Open Badges project, and Kathy Davidson, who's Duke Professor and co-founder of Haystack, who is administering the Badges for Lifelong Learning competition. So the way we're going to work today is I'll do a short introduction about the webinar, and then I'm going to have Carla walk us through some slides about the Open Badges project, and then I'll moderate questions. Oh, I'm sorry, actually after Carla I'll do a very short set of slides about different examples, and then we'll open up for questions and have Kathy join us and Carla and answer questions that you may want to submit. One thing I want to say about the interaction with this webinar, the best way to participate in the back channel is Twitter hashtag DML badges. You can submit questions into the chat box, and we'll filter through those and try to get through as many as we can today. Last Badges webinar that we did on the Badges 101, we put some of the questions up on the Questions and Themes forum thread on haystack.org, which is a link I think that we have on the home page of the slides. Maybe not. I think you have to go to the groups, the Badges group, and then there's a forum there that have some of the questions. And they're also on the dmlcompetition.net blog. This one today, the webinar we're doing today, will be archived on dmlcompetition.net along with the other ones. This is our third in a series of webinars. It's the second one that we've done on Badges 101. Hopefully we'll get lots of questions that we can put out there for people to take a look, those who weren't able to join us on either of the webinars, or if you want to go back and look over what we've done before. The next webinar that we're doing is another DML competition process and application with David Theo Goldberg and Carla Casilli, and that takes place October 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then special this week we have Mark Sermon, who will be Steve Hargadon's guest on the Future of Education series, Thursday, October 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard. And that event is, you could Google it or you can find it listed in the competitions, the Badges group, or on the competitions landing page on haystack.org under events. If you want to see any of the other scheduled webinars that are coming up, you can find those on the dmlcompetition.net blog as well. And just to make sure everybody knows, those of you who are planning on applying, hopefully by now you know that the Stage 1 competition deadline has been extended to November 14th. So I'm going to just jump right in to introducing Carla. Carla, if you would like to tell everybody about the Open Badges and a little bit about your involvement with them. We'll just wait for the, I think the audio is still catching up with us, so we'll just give a couple seconds for Carla to get her audio working.
Is that working now? Sorry about that. I was talking away. Hi everyone. Hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the DML webinar on Badges 101 and tell you that my name is Carla Casilli, as Cheryl mentioned, and I am the Operations Manager for Mozilla Open Badges project. And just a little bit briefly about the how Mozilla Foundation is involved in the Open Badges. There's been a lot of time and energy spent in efforts surrounding badges, and particularly around the conceptual framework, but also equally around building the tech infrastructure. And today what I'm going to be talking to you about, the main purpose of my discussion will be to kind of provide a foundational representation of what we mean when we talk about badges and how we arrived here, and also show some examples of how badges might work for learners around the world. And if you're looking at our first slide where it says the Open Badges, you can see Eduardo Lopez. And Eduardo is a good representation for us because he's indicating as kind of an aspect of the DML competition that it's Badges for Lifelong Learning. And Eduardo might seem a little atypical for a learner academically, but in this instance he's actually an excellent representation. So a little bit about that. Then, if we take a look at the next slide, we're asking, what are badges? And this is a question I think that keeps coming up a lot. And badges are kind of just for us visual representations of skills, achievements, and interests, and competencies, or even affiliations. And so I think it's a word that everybody hears, but it's actually gaining a different meaning as we move along. And if we take kind of look backwards, scouting might be the first example that comes to mind when people think about it, scouting or even military badges. And that's pretty typical because we've all had, or we might have had, some interaction with badging systems as we were growing up and being involved in organizations. And then, but if we move forward and we take a look at more and more, we're seeing badges kind of move online and be representations of achievements on the web. And this image kind of is a nice representation of what it means to have a Foursquare badge. And Foursquare is an interesting badging system because it's really about social skills, and in this case, really about social status. So you check in and you get awards for checking in. And it really doesn't have a lot of experience kind of behind that. It's really just a matter of visiting locations. But if we take a look at Stack Overflow, on the other hand, this is actually a badge system that is functioning and has been around for a while. It represents real skills, and skills that are based on real tasks and work, and they're also kind of peer assigned. And so it's taking that idea of badging, and I think the traditional idea of badging, and extending it out in a digital environment. And then how can that be useful and effective? The great thing about what's happening with Stack Overflow is it reflects two different aspects of badging, right? Two different aspects of skills and competencies. And those are both technical and social. And technical are kind of the hard skills. Do you know how to do certain things? Are you good at JavaScript? Are you good at any kind of technical software? But then also, what about, are you a great commenter? Or are you a good supporter? Are you a good teacher? And those social skills are the kind of things that actually are, in some ways, the most beneficial to people as they move through their lives. They're the social skills that kind of ease the way for people to find pathways. And so here Stack Overflow is actually allowing that environment for people to show both hard and soft skills. And what happens with that is with Careers 2.0, Stack Overflow is kind of taking that idea of all of that information that's resident and inherent in all those badges, and it's now creating a website. And what's happening is that employers are willing to pay for that because those are exactly the kind of skills that they're looking for. And so it's, we're starting to see this kind of value chain of not only what people can do, but also how there's an opportunity to see a value related to that. So the big question, I think, that instead of just thinking about from the technical standpoint, what happens, what if we start using badges for learning? And what does that mean? And that's, I think, a lot of times when we're thinking about badging in this point, we're thinking about it from an academic standpoint. But this is something that Mozilla's been thinking about for quite some time, and we're trying to extend that metaphor and make it useful. So if we take a look here, there are actually some examples that I can point to, and this is a representation of peer-to-peer university, and that's what P2PU stands for. And peer-to-peer university is an open ed peer learning environment, and they actually run a subset of courses called the School of Webcraft. And the School of Webcraft happens to be a work that Mozilla actually funds and works with. So peer-to-peer university and Mozilla actually work together to create the School of Webcraft. And here there are actually different badge systems, and those badge systems are both skill badge system, one badge system that has two parts, so skill badges and community/peer badges. And you can take a look at just some of the badges that are on screen right now. So there's a JavaScript badge and a PHP badge and an open source contributor badge, but then there are also these peer mentor badges and problem solver/innovator badges. So the badges on the right that are red are kind of representing hard skills, and the badges in the blue on the left are representing all these soft skills that are actually really useful in online environments and also offline environments. But now we're having the ability to recognize those skills. Likewise, if we take a look at another program, which is the after-school program called iRemix, iRemix is a networked platform for after-school programs. And the way that those programs work is that they're really trying to work on learning and demonstrating digital literacies for students. And so here it's the same kind of idea. There's a badge system that's been created, and there's a whole bunch of assessments and criteria that have gone into the thinking about these badge systems. And then they've developed a system where people can achieve certain levels, and then that can be shared back with schools. So there's kind of a nice reciprocity here that happens, that not only are people learning in these informal environments and after-school environments, and a lot of it is, you know, self-taught, or it's being taught on being taught by themselves or peer-to-peer teaching. And so there's lots of opportunities to see that kind of feedback into this system. Likewise, if we take a look at the museums and science centers, there's lots of activity that are happening outside in kind of in this way, informal learning. But there are outreach organizations, and there are programs, and there are camps, and lots of opportunities. And this is what you're looking at here is the American Museum of Natural History. They actually have developed badges themselves, and they have a navigator badge and an explorer badge. And these are things that people who are joining these organizations or taking these courses can now have representations of their learning. So that these are all existing out in the world right now. So other areas that are starting to think about badges are the government agencies. So in this instance, NASA, and they have all kind of fascinating things. They have virtual camps, and they have a robotics arm, and now they're considering expressing these representations as these learning representations as badges. So they're one of our collaborators that we're working with on the DML competition, and we're really excited about the potential for the robotics badge that they're thinking about. The other organization that I want to talk about a little briefly is the 4-H. And 4-H has a really amazing curriculum that they've developed that's been kind of all offline, and now they're trying to shift it into the digital world. So they're another one of our collaborators, and we're looking forward to seeing exactly what they're going to be producing, and some of that is going to be able to be seen on their new website, my4h.org. So we're hoping to see some really great badge systems develop out of that, and also see how you can kind of cross over from the analog world to the digital world. But if we, so as we thought about it, and we're thinking about all these extant badge systems, all these badge systems that exist outside, and we were at Mozilla, we were asking ourselves, what if these existing badge systems weren't independent and isolated? What if there were a way to bring them all into one location so that there was a shared badge ecosystem and infrastructure? And that's something that Mozilla's really trying to work for on the infrastructure portion. So in this instance, what we're saying, like, what if we thought about all of these different audiences? So there are educators who want to engage learners in new ways, and then there are learners/recipients here of badges, and how can they illustrate their skills that they're gaining in lots of different areas across the web and across the world? And then employers, how can we actually create a system so that employers can find a use or meaning to all of those badge systems that exist? And the next slide is actually kind of an overview of how all of these things come together. So in Mozilla's mind, so there are the badge issuers, and those are all kind of different organizations, so that they're not only academic institutions, but they're also online learning opportunities, and then there are groups and organizations as well. And they can all issue badges, and then they go to the learner / recipient. In this instance, we're referring to them as recipient, as they're the ones who gain the badges. And then they can all live in the backpack. So that's really where Mozilla's open badge infrastructure has its most value, because from there, then the learner can then share that information, share those learnings and skills and competencies across different sites. So they might be able to share them, on their blog or on different social media sites, or use them on their resume, and then that will in turn allow them to have a greater interaction with both employers, but also other peers and other colleagues. And so the one thing that I would like to emphasize here that is, I think, very important is that in the badge ecosystem, a badge is not just a visual. It's actually a lot more than just a visual badge. It encompasses a lot of metadata, and it also has material that kind of stands behind it and represents the badge. So it's not only who the issuer is and the recipient is, but also why they got that badge, and then what were the criteria behind that, and whether or not that badge has a life cycle. So if it's only good for so long, if it expires. So that's kind of some of the idea about what's happening with the badge system. So why do we need this or something like it? Well, there's lots of opportunity to get different material, different information at this point. And education is changing, right? The access to data and information is evolving. And Wikipedia is an excellent example, and even the MIT OpenCourseWare. A lot of these things are now free and open access, and people have lots of opportunities to learn and be self-taught. And from that standpoint, then there's no way in the traditional credentialing system for them to actually be able to represent that learning. So there's lots of opportunities, as I mentioned. There's, the iRemix, and there's Peer-to-Peer University, and Maker Faire, and the American Museum of Natural History. So all of these organizations are out there offering ways to learn, and so we'd like to be able to present that in a way that's free and open source. So essentially, we need a way to recognize learning regardless of where or how it occurs, and that includes new and informal pathways. And we need to capture all types of learning. So badges and assessments can actually offer us a way to get there. So what are some examples of how this can help? And I'm going to move through these relatively quickly because Cheryl's going to have some similar, I think, representations. So here we have Eduardo, and Eduardo is a person who is still in school. He has lots of outreach activities, lots of computer and digital literacy skills, but he actually doesn't really have any way to indicate them in school. So he's kind of self-taught. And if he had badges and there were a badge system that could accommodate that, then he could actually have a way to feed back into his schools and represent that to his teachers, and then they could potentially modify his learning opportunities. Sarah's kind of in a similar situation. She's about to graduate, and she is thinking about going to college, and she has lots of skills and competencies in the web universe, but everything that she knows is kind of beyond what the local community college is that she has access to. So she kind of doesn't see college as a step forward for her. And she would like to get a job, but in order to get a job, she would like to be able to represent her skills. And if there were badges and a badge ecosystem, then she could go ahead and present that information in a way that was useful and that employers could find beneficial. Jin is in a situation where she is actually moving. So she's established herself as an artist in her environment, but she's going to be moving, and because she's moving, she's concerned that some of the contacts that she's made and some of the relationships that she's built up will be lost. And so if there was a badge system that could represent Jin's kind of learning and Jin's artistic endeavors, then she could also have a way to represent, and that could be communicated across different environments. Sal, similar issue. He actually, although this is one that I think a lot of people are running into right now because of the environment from an economic standpoint. Sal's actually, he's a busy parent. He wants to switch careers. He's actually just recently lost his job, and so he's actually gone out and tried to find different information so that he can gather that together and represent all of his new learnings and skills. And there's currently no way to do that because he's kind of done this all online in a digital world. And so if the badge ecosystem existed, then Sal could actually represent all of his learning and that they would be recognized by employers. Likewise, Karen here is actually a hiring manager. So she's one of those people that those few other people would be interacting with. And she's kind of inundated with a whole bunch of information. She gets lots and lots of resumes, but there's no way for her to know specifically, well, what's on someone's resume, is it really, does it actually accurately represent the person? And so Karen has the opportunity with the badge system to be able to click through and actually see what the skills and competencies were that the badges represent. And can also see the soft skills that are really important and help make people really good employees as well. So how can you get involved? And that leads us directly to this, the Digital Media and Learning Competition #4, Badges for Lifelong Learning. This is exactly the kind of thing that we would like to see come to fruition, and that we think that a lot of the badge systems are going to come out here are going to start to fill the badge ecosystem and also develop a really valuable ecosystem, and that there will be intrinsic value will automatically arise from this. And so you go to dmlcompetition.net and also take a look at the openbadges.org. And there's lots of information about the technical aspect of the Open Badge infrastructure that Mozilla is working on, and you can feel free to visit that at your leisure. But that kind of wraps it up from the Open Badges Mozilla infrastructure, and I'm going to wrap up and pass the presentation back to Ruby.
Hi, it's Cheryl here. I'm going to jump in now and just do a circle back to our last webinar when we had lots of requests for examples. So I went out and I've pulled together some examples just to help talk through what I think some of the questions were that we had, what they were trying to get at. And I'm going to do that by going to this first slide here. And all this information, all the links that are on these slides, we'll post these online if you don't want to write them down, and you can go directly to the source. I tried to find resources that were openly available. You didn't have to go through a library database or a vendor to get to them. I like this first one here. Two researchers went and created a typology, and I think this is a good thing to think about when you're going through, if you like to do things in a systematic way, thinking about what you want the badge to do. And they can have all of these functions, or you can focus on just some of the functions. So the first one that I've sort of reorganized this in a way that I think helps with the top-down. I think instruction, the idea that when you go into an online environment and you can get what Anton and Churchill are referring to as the gestalt of the community, you can see what is valued by the badges that are there, the social shaping, the social norms of a system. And so it has a value on its own, even if people aren't trying to acquire all the badges. They immediately see that these are the things that are being valued by this community. Then the second thing is reputation, and that's obviously showing somebody's interest, their expertise, their past interactions. And just as Carla was saying earlier, it substitutes for direct experience, and it tells a learner's story. And also the one thing too, I think, is it can show levels of engagement. It can show if you're casual or committed based on how much interaction is being visualized by the number of badges and the kinds of badges. And often a lot of these systems will use other kinds of visual displays to show exactly how active somebody is, but that's certainly one thing that can be captured by a badge. At the status affirmation one, I think, is interesting because it allows a little bit of flexibility, and I think this is where things become very different than, say, an external reward. It allows people those who are motivated for status to behave in a certain way, and those who are motivated by affirmation. So somebody who is seeking status may say, I value this because the community looks upon it favorably. This is a difficult achievement and I've achieved it. And they may be motivated by the idea of that having some value. And then there's also affirmation, which is for an individual to look and say to themselves, I did achieve this. This is a milestone that I was able to get past in my goal setting, and they have this ability to sort of tell their own story back to themselves. Then group identification provides a sense of solidarity. I think this one is one of the most interesting ones for our digital environment, because for those who have been in group projects in school or group projects at work, particularly in school, coming up with metrics to determine who did what in any kind of group situation ultimately becomes a weird grading dynamic. And with a badge, I feel like this probably does a better job of showing exactly how somebody contributed rather than trying to resort to some sort of numerical or quantitative assessment. So group identification is a big one, either within the group or outside the group, trying to signal exactly what it is that is being leveraged there. And then the one that is probably the most commonly thought of when we think of badges is goal setting. And so there are different things that people say about motivating toward external rewards and how people are motivated to set goals and achieve them. And I think that the way everybody designs their badge systems, they're going to find out that there's a lot of differences depending on the groups, depending on the context, depending on the time of life that somebody's at. But goal setting is definitely one that gives people something to work toward. There's smaller things along the way, and there's lots of experimental studies that show if a goal is just at a comfortable reach, if there's immediate feedback, if people see their progress, they tend to behave a little bit differently. So in that typology, which I think is those are good things to be thinking about when you're trying to get your head around what are my badges going to do, what exactly does this badge mean for the learner, et cetera, et cetera. I think that provides a nice framework. A couple of other things to be thinking about with badges are that they're not always going to have explicit feedback. So for example, the game America's Army, the feedback is not explicit, and so it's just a different model, a different way of trying to get the learner to be thinking in some ways how people do things in real life, but you then have to have a lot of things built in the game that signal information to help them figure out, maybe it's not explicit feedback, but they can at least make sense of it in order to understand how something could be achieved. And the designer is really ultimately making the decision on that one. So the next slide that I'd like to do, and this kind of comes up based on some questions people had about informal learning and constructionism, or I guess constructivism as well. And this example was done in 2000, and the paper that this is pulled from is not necessarily about badges. It's sort of tacked on at the end, but it was this idea of how can we tell in constructionist learning environments if achievement is even. And they did an interesting project on a group of students, a group of learners who were in this digital environment where they were learning how to program, and they found that the digital traces that they were able to capture showed them that the achievement was uneven for reasons not only to do with what they were learning together as a group, but also what people were bringing into the situation. There were some gender issues, there were some obvious things that they were able to capture quantitatively, and so they wanted to know if you have some informal learning happening and you want to be able to say, is there any kind of achievement that we can refer to, they wanted to insert a merit badge system. Now in this example, this is not a digital badge, although the kids were working in a digital environment, but it still has a lot of the thinking that goes especially into constructionism. Excuse me, I'm having trouble with that word today. So it's a good paper to look at. They do some very interesting ways of capturing the quantitative data that could be an algorithm that goes into an assessment for a badge, but I think they also raise some good questions. They talk about how the merit badge system combines elements of a portfolio assessment as well as peer tutoring. And I'm just going to give you an example of what they were suggesting would happen if somebody was to work toward a badge. A child would first find a sponsor, and a sponsor could be somebody who already earned that badge or one of the group of community leaders designated who could give badges to the applicant. And with the help of that sponsor, the applicant would then prepare a project portfolio demonstrating understanding of whatever concept it was. And when the student and the sponsor felt the portfolio was ready, they would submit it for anonymous review. The reviewer then would approve the application, the student would be awarded the badge, and the sponsor also could be rewarded a badge for the achievement. The sponsor might be another person whose badge changed color to show that they had sponsored a certain number of learners, and they could also have a badge that showed that they were eligible to be an anonymous reviewer for more of those badges. And when you had earned a certain number of badges, you might be eligible to lead the community badge presentation ceremony. So they sort of worked through a process that they thought retroactively might work with the kind of situation they had, and it's a nice step-by-step that might give people a framework if they want to come up with ideas for their own situation. They do mention, the questions that they mention is the delicate balance between a radical constructionist perspective, and by constructionism they're defining that as something that eschews assessment and insists that the project should be its own reward, and then the more traditional perspective, which sees assessment as an essential component of any learning environment that can meet the demands of functioning in a real classroom. So that delicate balance is definitely playing out in the conversation that we're having about badges, and trying to figure out how we can do this so that we're not detracting from the self-motivated nature of the learner in the learning environment. So that's one good example, and we're not endorsing any of these. I'm just trying to point people to examples of what others have explored in depth and sort of written levels of process that might be useful when people are designing their own badges. So the next slide, I want to take a look at the Global Kids Badging System report. And Global Kids is an organization that does both consulting. They work a lot with informal as well as, I would say, some traditional as well, in giving kids the tools to use digital media and learning in ways that empower them. And for this project, They used badges, and I should say Global Kids, they do more in this report than just this one example, but they have used badges in learning for 2 years. They've given many different examples. They've used badges with high school students who are using social media for social good. They used the 3 corners, I think, of their digital literacy badges were talk about, recognize, and do. And the one example that's mainly brought to the surface in this badging system that they've written about is in a K-5 situation. And I'm going to recommend that people go and read that one because they do a really nice job of showing how they went in and the kind of legwork that had to go into setting up this system in concert with the people who were running the school program, and then really working this out together. And this is one of the challenges of coming up with learning content and then having people come in to design the badges that go with it. The whole process that you'll go through is going to really depend on what your learning objectives are, your learning goals, the classroom objectives, what it is that you want to see at the end of the badging system. And they had, I believe in their example, they had a physical digital literacy transcript, sort of an associated digital portfolio. And some of the questions, there's a lot in there, so I do recommend that people go read it, but some of the questions I wanted to pull out so that these give you an idea of some of the things that people are thinking about before they even start thinking about how the badges are actually going to operate as a digital artifact. Do you let the youth see the rubrics? And the rubrics were, I believe, 0 to 3, and sort of had that 0 being nothing was accomplished, nothing was obtained or achieved, all the way up to 3, which was above and beyond. And so sort of loosely allowing things to fall into those classic rubrics. Do the parents see the rubrics? Who can assign the badges? When and how often is a badge conferred? How can youth bring in evidence of their own learning to earn a badge? How can peer review be incorporated into the process? And do you start over each year from scratch, or do their badges carry over year to year? And how does that affect the criteria for applying them? And I pulled out those questions because I think that those are great things to think about, especially if you're working in a more traditional environment where kids have criteria that they have to meet, and parents involved, and lots of other considerations that are a little bit different than for adults who are going through career transitions and things like that. But they're a fantastic resource, and I think they do a really nice job of getting people to think about some of the big key questions. I thought, too, another thing that was really nice when they were discussing some of the things that happened as a result, they found that there were kids who seemed to be more motivated at the end of it to do different things when they're looking, and this comes back, I think, to the idea of a badge functioning as instruction, sort of that Gestalt idea, that when they saw what was there, they looked at them to say, that's a badge that I would be interested, I would like to work for that badge. So in some ways, this is an assessment system, but in other ways, it really did seem to function a little bit more like an identity, a mirroring back of, this is something that I would like to have identified with myself. So they did find that there did seem to be some changes in how kids were motivated in their learning. And they also found that the parents were really interested in it. It gave them something visual and something, sort of a shared object. It was that idea, I think, of group identification, that they saw their kids visually represented as being part of a group and saw the individual aspects of their young learners being represented as well. So I wanted to go to this next one to give people an idea of higher education and somebody who's gone through a nice job of the steps that might be involved in coming up with a process for implementing badges. And Alex Halevay is a professor, and he's been involved in thinking about badges as early as the Mozilla Drumbeat Festival. And that link that's available there will take you to his website, and he walks through what I think are some really good things to be thinking about when you're coming up with a process. And again, there's obviously a lot more that people can think of for their own situations, but this to me is a nice way to sort of get the mind working, and it may actually influence the way you think about your learner content if you're a stage 1 applicant, if you can think of the different ways that you would implement it or how you want those badges to work, and some of the different questions that are going to come up. And so with that process, there's a section that Alex pulls out called nomination of evidence form, and I think these are interesting, and I've listed the main ones in bullet form there: the name of the badge, the issuer of the badge, the version of this badge, the last time it might be updated, the badge image, how it's going to look, the description, the textual description of what the badge represents, in case, as will probably happen, people will see these different pictorial depictions and need to know a little bit more information about what they actually represent, who it is that's claiming the badge, the recipient, and the nominator. And he does talk a little bit about how any badge can be self-nominated, and I know from looking at some different communities, online communities, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the value of a badge becomes cheapened if peers are allowed to self-award. But I like the idea of self-nominating and then having the community be able to say, well, this might have not been something that they recognize, but this candidate is saying, I think that this would be a good badge for me. So I think there are interesting design questions at sort of every level, depending on how you want the community to respond to badges. That when you were nominated or when you did the nomination, there would be a timestamp, the requirements and evidence. And this to me is what is so exciting about the open badges and the digital badge idea, is that because we have so much information online, and as Carla was saying, we also have a lot of open information that we can use in our learning assessments, our learning stories. But it also is getting to the point where it's very hard to convey authenticity, the authority that you might have, or your expertise. And instead of just relying on a visual representation, for example, the way merit badges work in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, the idea of having this information that comes with you, the requirements and the evidence that says these were the criteria this badge earner had to meet in order for this badge to be awarded, and this is an example, and this is what Stack Overflow does so nicely. This is an example of the kind of work that meant this badge was awarded and was validated and meaningful. And I think that's one of the things that makes this a little bit different than just a regular offline, real life, I guess you could say, offline life badge system. And so then also, I think, yes, the issue date and time, the expiry date and time, if any, and the last two I think are really great ideas as well. The recipient's comments and notes and a list of community comments. I think having that information go with the badge makes it an incredibly rich object to show what it is that a learner has achieved. So those are three examples that show a lot of process. There's plenty of examples of badges being used in different online communities. Sometimes it's hard just to look at them, though. It takes a long time to dig down deep. The reason I like these three examples is because they really walk you through process, and I think it will be helpful for people to apply those to their own situations and start thinking about different angles of questions that might determine how their own badge systems and their own learning content as well might be perceived. And that goes into whether or not, for example, in the Global Kids, they had one situation where there was one badge that the whole program, once you went through the whole program, there was only one badge for accomplishing that program, and then there are other levels of granular in different programs. The learners were learning things that were a little bit less a one-shot deal and more sort of granular along the way. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to open this. I think that Kathy is with us, Kathy Davidson, and earlier, as I was saying, Kathy's Duke professor. Kathy's also on book tour right now, and Kathy's got probably, in my experience, some of the most cutting-edge experiments and experience with different forms of assessment in higher education and informal traditional classroom settings. And she's on book tour right now. Chapter 4 I know because I've just read this myself. She covers why we measure and what we measure, and so can bring a lot of really thought-provoking questions to the philosophical aspect of badges. And Kathy's book is Now You See It. So we may be getting a little bit of background from Kathy when people have questions directly for her about how this might work and some of the implications and some of the bigger picture questions. So I think what we're going to do is jump into questions, and as they come up and people might have different responses. I'll try and direct them to the right person, but Carla and Kathy, if you hear one and it sounds like something that you'd really like to contribute to, feel free to jump in. So I think the first one here is, this is a good question, and I can answer this one because this is probably in response to what I was just talking about, or maybe this is in response to what Carla was saying, but what about the more formal learning activities such as Common Core standards, which leads to Common Core assessments, which could be converted into a badge system? So I'm guessing that that question has to do with, we talked a lot about informal learning and open learning and open content, and so how could a badge system work within a traditional school setting? And I think all three of us could probably answer that, but I know Kathy's just joined us, so I'm gonna send that actually to Kathy, and maybe you can give us an example or your ideas, Kathy, and how that could work. How it could work with something as I'm going to say rigid as Common Core assessments.
Actually, that's not an area that I know, so I'm going to pass that one back to somebody else.
Okay. Well, I do have an opinion about this. I think
Great,
that
go for it.
I think that the Common Core assessments, for those of you who don't know, there are, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a number of states now who have adopted Common Core assessments in response to, or in terms of having earned the race to the top grants that the Department of Ed just handed out. So there are now starting to be some standards among these different states which we haven't had before. I think that it is, the juggernaut is the same thing as No Child Left Behind, that when that starts to relax a little, we're going to start to see more flexibility in terms of what teachers can do in their classroom. I know in a lot of the traditional school classroom settings, when people are trying this or they're curious about this or they're interested, they are doing it in ways that sort of support their curriculum already. And so with the Common Core assessments, I don't think it's going to be any different. The questions then become similar ones that are mentioned in the examples that I just talked about, which is, how is that going to affect the motivation? How are you going to prevent something from becoming so competitive that you then have this negative outcome? So it's really looking at the learning theories that the teachers want to work with and how they perceive some of these different badge functions that we're talking about earlier, how those are going to work within a system that's fairly binding with the No Child Left Behind. And nobody, obviously I don't know of anybody who has worked with the Common Core assessments and worked with badges in this way, but I think badges can be worked into any system, but the real question is going to be on how the different motivations change and the side effects of the outcomes. We want the outcomes to obviously get these kids working toward their goals without making their motivation or making them demotivated. So I'm going to move on to.
Just add to that. This is Carla.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, let me just add to that. I think one thing that we'd like to encourage to as much as possible is that the badge system and the badge ecosystem can be thought of as kind of a both and rather than an either or. And we don't feel like one has to supersede the other. And so they can live together in that ecosystem.
Great, that's a good point. So I've got a question here that says, how are assessments actually integrated into the badges? How is achievement validated? That's probably a good question for Carla.
I actually think that might be a few questions embedded into one. And that's something that Cheryl's touched on just briefly, is recognizing that the open badge infrastructure that Mozilla is building is actually something that is allowing the mobility of the badges to move across the open web. And so the assessment and all of the rubrics and the thinking that happens prior to the badge development is something that is a very large aspect. And so I think we're seeing the opportunity to kind of completely rethink assessment and rethink the way that information is represented and awarded. And then the way that Mozilla is addressing it is that we want to make sure that that information can flow freely everywhere. I don't know if that exactly answers that question.
If the person who asked that still has questions, they can let our moderators know in the chat box. I've got another question here. Could a third party issue a badge based on the completion of an open course without the input of the original institution? Could badges be issued based on interaction and skills with content and tools without the oversight of the content tools creator? And does the Creative Commons license deal at all with third-party accreditation and recognition? So that's a lot packed into that question. That's a great question. Carla, that probably is one that you might be able to help with.
Sure, that's actually something we're thinking about. Right now, the way that the Open Badge infrastructure is working is that there are kind of two aspects to it. There are issuers, and then there are also, actually three to four aspects. Issuers, recipients, and displayers, and then ultimately we're also looking at endorsers. And endorsers are going to kind of represent the opportunity to be kind of third-party endorsers, so that if there's a specific badge or badge system that people really like, that some organization really likes, and they would like to endorse it rather than develop their own, then that's actually something that we see coming down the road. And right now, I would say it would be a little difficult to be a third-party issuer without actually getting the initial organization involved in some way. So that question is a little fuzzy for me. And I do believe that some of these questions, specifically one I think exactly like that, was asked in an earlier webinar. And if you go to the Haystack site, some of these will actually, and just read through those questions and answers. We've attempted to answer them all there. But that's a great question. And then moving forward, what does it mean to be an issuer, and what does it mean to be a displayer, and what does it mean to be an endorser? And some of this, because this is kind of a giant experiment in a lot of ways, some of these things are things that we're working on as we move along, and they're great questions, and they cause us to spur us to think about some of the issues. But being an issuer is kind of a significant undertaking, and it's not something that you can kind of well, Cheryl mentioned a little earlier, and it's true, you can be you can eventually be able to create your own badges. In order to do that, you still have to develop all of that assessment and all the criteria that kind of lead up to the badge. Otherwise, your badge doesn't have a lot of intrinsic value. And that's something that as the ecosystem grows, we'll start to see more and more of, where value is going to become the trading point for the badges. So there might be lots of badges, but eventually things will kind of rise to the top as levels of expectation and desire kind of move through the system.
Great, thank you, Carla. I know this next question has to do with badge standards, and the idea of authority and quality control. In my overview, I looked through that we had more than 100 blog posts, substantial blog posts that showed up after we launched the competition, and I went through them and looked at some of the themes, and definitely quality control and standards was a big theme. And this next question gets to that. Is there a badge standard? Are some worth more than others based on who issues them? Who is developing the assessment standards and rubrics? And here in this question, I'm lumping these all together because they sort of all are touching on the same thing, but there is a related question. Are we concerned with how organizations that might issue badges will establish their own reputation, which is to say, how does the community know that badges issued by the X School of Web Design are valuable or perhaps not? And Kathy, I know you talked a little bit about this in an earlier question similar to the one Carla was saying is posted on Haystack, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about the idea of quality control or the idea of employers having some sort of reputation of their own or some control over quality. I don't hear Kathy, so maybe we'll throw that to...
Question. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
Okay. The question is, it has to do a little bit, you answered this question to some extent on the forums, the questions and themes before. Is there a badge standard, or does there need to be a badge standard? Are some worth more than others based on who issues them? And
I actually think, okay, I actually think that there needs to be interoperability, and that's why the the backpack is so useful, but that in fact the whole point of badges is for an institution to look within itself and figure out peer-to-peer what its organization wants to value. And rather than there being a standard, I think it's the metadata that makes the specificity of the badge appropriate to that organization, and then whoever wants to find that badge content can find out exactly that specificity. It's precisely that we so often inherit systems of accreditation from elsewhere, whether that's grade or human resource departments or institutional practices that don't fit our own values and our own workplace and our own learning goals, that make current that make, for me, this a really wonderful experiment and helping all of us to really think about what we do count and what should count. But because of that, there isn't one standard, and there shouldn't be. The flexibility of badges and the way badges carry content are exactly what allow organizations to be introspective and decide what they want to value.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that actually touches on one of the things that's really exciting about some of the things you've done in your classroom, Kathy, having the people who are learning actually have a say in what they value, and that makes the badge system a little bit different than the top-down that we've been talking about a lot. And I was mentioning Stack Overflow. Wikipedia does the same thing, where the community actually nominates an idea for a badge, and then there's this system of validating it or deciding that it really is worthy. And I think it'll be interesting to see how much of the peer-assessed badge systems that we see coming out, or this type of reflexive idea that Kathy's talking about, where people are looking to say the badges themselves are going to show what it is that they're going to show the quality in what goes with them if there's a portfolio. So I hope that covers the question. And Carla, if you have anything to add, just jump in. Otherwise, we've got some other questions here.
Sure, I just wanted to add that I think that it's just an opportunity to actually move outside of the traditional rankings and criteria, and
Absolutely.
I'd like to really emphasize that it's the opportunity there, and instead of relying on the idea that there are all these standards that are pre-existing, because those standards that are pre-existing are the things that need help. So
Right.
let's use the opportunity.
Yes, this is Kathy again. I actually think if badges simply replicate grades, we've all wasted our time. That, in fact, what badging allows us to do and even forces us to do is really assess assessment and think about what we want to give credit to and what we want to credentialize as an organization, and how peers can be involved in that process. And that, to me, we're at a really important juncture for doing that, and on every level, whether that's informal learning, formal learning, businesses, on the whole array of opportunities and organizations.
This next question that's come in, thank you, Kathy and Carla. The next question that is coming in, I think, is a hard question, and I think I'm just going to ask it and see who can answer it. Please address the security or the non-hackability of the badges. I think this is getting to the quality control and the authority and making sure that these are something that people can't just create and make and slap up on the web.
Well, I think there's two questions, and I can talk about the general, and then Carla might be able to talk about the technical. Security is both keeping people in and keeping people out. In other words, you don't want people to be able to fake their own, to game or fake their own systems. You also don't want people to be able to invade people's privacy. So one of the things I'm sure that, and I know that Mozilla is working on very hard, is exactly security and privacy, and each one is a flip side of the other. Carla, I don't know if you want to talk about that any more than that.
Sure. Actually, that's a great segue. Absolutely, we are considering what it means to have badges be secure, but we're also considering what it means to be the recipient of those badges and have control over those badges. So I think it's two sides of the same coin. It's being able to recognize that people will want to display these, and some people might want to keep them private, and they default to private. So that's something that we definitely. The entire badge ecosystem is built around the recipient. It's kind of recognizing that the recipient is the one that has the option of being able to display learning and skills and competencies. And while the issuers can assign them, it's really up to the recipient to say, yes, I would like to share this information, and yes, it's valuable. And so from a security and privacy standpoint, we're definitely looking into that. The question about how can badges themselves be secure, it's a technical issue. The badges are based on, right now they're based on the email address, and that's the way they get kind of sent around the web, and they're assigned to one person. And that's something that we're thinking about as we move forward about how to make sure that things are secure.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question.
I think the focus, if I can just build on what Carla said, the focus on the recipient is very important, because most traditional inherited forms of assessment that we have right now are much more about an employer rewarding and meriting and sometimes even punishing a recipient for doing or not doing certain kinds of tasks that the hierarchy, the person in charge has deemed in advance are important. The thing about this badge system is recipients can keep that information, can earn that information, can display that information as they wish. So it's a really different motivational opportunity here than in a traditional rewards and recognition system.
Yeah, I know that I would say one of the other big themes that has shown up as people are writing is how is this going to change learner motivation, and I think it's going to change. I think it will change. It seems to be that people have preconceived ideas that this is going to work like an external reward, but the thing that I've been reading and I've found anecdotally very interesting is that this aspect of identity and using this to present identity and having more choices than are usually given by a very limiting system of an A, B, C, or D, but having something that actually conveys your identity seems to allow this creativity that can change the way learners respond. So if it's a badge system that's basically like a gold, silver, bronze that doesn't convey a lot of identity, it seems to have a different effect than if there's something about that speaks to a person directly. They seem to be motivated by that for different reasons.
Absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, certainly in my own peer learning experiments at Duke, I find that students who get to Duke are typically straight-A students. They've figured out how to game me and game their professors into A's when they're working for peers and working for recognition among their peers. The motivation is so high that I often find my job is to sort of lower the standards, not raise the standards, that they're extremely motivated not only to learn, but to learn together and to test one another in the most kind of participatory way and challenge one another to greater and greater challenges. Sometimes I worry that they're going to do badly in their other classes, though, because they're so engaged and so excited about what they're doing. And it's very much a system where the students themselves are constructing the system, are evaluating the system constantly as we're moving through the course.
Yeah, and I'd like to use that opportunity to say that in our badge group on Haystack, I've put up, Kathy's got several posts, why badges, why not, as well as crowdsourcing grading, and I think that gives a great insight into how this idea of allowing the learners to be contributing to their own peer assessment. I think that's a really interesting blog post for people to read if you want to see a little bit more about that. I've just been given notice that we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to look at some of these questions that have to do with employment. And I think this is obviously on everyone's mind as we're going through a difficult economy and hoping that learners, informal learners, but learners in transition can use this system in some way to help leverage their job skills. So the question is, can badges provide a mechanism for employers to better identify and recruit suitable employees and vice versa?
Sure.
I think right now, yeah, go ahead, Carla.
Oh, sorry. I think exactly that was one of the examples that I tried to give at the end. Karen was the hiring manager. I think this is exactly the kind of thing that's going to ease a lot of hiring situations and allow people to illustrate that they've done all kind of learning that has been like post school or if completely outside of school, but they've gone to the trouble to actually go ahead and educate themselves. So in some ways, as you mentioned a little earlier, Cheryl, it shows that you are a motivated learner, and that actually plays a big role, and that's something I think that even on Stack Overflow, that Careers 2.0 is something that has kind of developed up out of that, so I think we'll see more and more of that.
Kathy, did you want to say something?
No, just thanks everybody for great questions and for great presentations, you guys. And you know, I think you'll give the information where people can find out more. And I hope people really use this opportunity to experiment, to think deeply about what accreditation is, to think deeply about how peers can come up with, to think as fluidly and creatively as possible about all the ways we learn together.
Agreed. Thank you, Kathy. And Carla, did you want to have one last comment about anything?
No, I think it's been a great webinar so far, and I just encourage everybody to go to dmlcompetition.net and also openbadges.org if you have any questions about specific technical issues.
And if you have follow-up questions or there was a question we didn't get to that you submitted, I'll be adding, a couple of us will be still going through the questions and answering them and putting them up on the dmlcompetition.net blog and also on the badges group on haystack.org. And thank you, everybody. We're right at 3 o'clock, so we're going to wrap up the webinar. We have our next one coming up on October 25th. And if you also want to interact with Mark's sermon, he will be on October 20th with Steve Hargadon on Future of Education series. So we have a couple opportunities for people to interact. And then in November, date to be determined as yet, but we will be doing a webinar specifically on badge designs and badge systems. So hopefully we'll have many of you come back and join us for that. Thank you, everybody.